Thanks everyone for joining. Neve, do you want to take it away?
Yes, thank you, Jess. I wonder, can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay. So hi everyone, my name is Neve Nivreen from the Transnational Institute. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, which will discuss Islamophobia in Europe. Maybe for those of us who don't know, for those of you who don't know Transnational Institute, we're a think tank and critical thinking research center based in Amsterdam, but doing research on cross-cutting themes and analysis from around the world. And today we'll be discussing the situation with Islamophobia in Europe. If you want to access more of our research, you can do so through our website, which is on your screen right now. And if you want to leave a donation, there's also a donation page that you can give a link to. Today's webinar is being hosted by TNI, Transnational Institute, but we're also co-sponsoring with a number of other organizations. So we have Spinwatch joining us from Britain, Easy Solutions from the Netherlands, which is also sponsoring the webinar, but can't join us today, unfortunately. NOR Foundation, based in the Netherlands as well. Then we have the Comité de Justice et Liberté pour tous from France, Alfanar from Spain, and Un Ponte Per also sponsoring the webinar from Italy. And we had initially envisaged this event to be an in-person interactive discussion based in Brussels, but unfortunately because of COVID-19, we had to reshape the event. So we're hosting a webinar, but we're hoping that it will be as interactive and as informative as possible in the current format. So hopefully you can join us by putting your questions in the chat function that Jess mentioned at the beginning. Today we have a very complete panel of experts. So we'll be joined from to speak on France by Yasser Louati and Benedict Courson. From Italy, we'll be joined by Francesco Alfonso Lesese. From the Netherlands, we'll be joined by Nawal Mustafa. From Spain, we'll be joined by Pedro Rojo. And from the UK, we'll be joined by Nazanin Masumi and David Miller. So I'll give a proper introduction to all of our speakers before they intervene, but just to mention them and thank them for their participation today in this webinar. And also thanks to everybody who's already connected. I can see we've over 100 participants already joining us and more are continuing to connect. So many thanks for joining us today for this discussion. You can also participate in Twitter if you use the hashtag TNI webinars. So maybe to start off the discussion and just to mention that in TNI, in our War and Pacification program, a lot of our research that we kept coming back to when we were looking at counterterrorism looked at how Muslims were constantly being targeted, were constantly being scapegoated, policed, surveilled, and that Islamophobia was becoming more and more institutionalized and more structural. In the last 2 or so decades, but even further back. But our research has mostly focused on the last 20 or so years. And what we could see in our research was that, political leaders, public officials, law and policy makers were making moves that were placing Islamophobia as structural, were making it more normalized. And of course, this has a huge knock-on effect for Muslims across Europe. And so we wanted to give some time to that in this discussion today and to really delve into the question of what political and social function does Islamophobia have in Europe today, and how can we begin to tackle that? So the first speaker that I want to introduce is Yasser Louati. Yasser is based in Paris. As I said, he's the director of the Comité de Justice et Liberté pour tous. And he's also been doing lots of research on national security policies, on social justice for minorities. And he's also appeared on a number of media outlets in recent weeks because of the situation that we've seen unfold in France in the last 20 years, maybe, or more so in the last 5 years, and even more recently in the last few weeks. So Yasser, I'm going to ask you to intervene and to begin by addressing this question that we've spoken about in person and often when you've been in Amsterdam, about France as a laboratory for Islamophobia. So I'm hoping you can kick us off with that question. So thank you very much, Yasser. And you're still on mute, Yasser, thank you.
How's my voice?
Very good, Yasser. Thank you. Loud and clear.
I should be a singer then. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that TNI took the matter of Islamophobia seriously for the past few years, more than any of the major NGOs in Europe, and especially when they deal on so many topics. And I'm not saying this because I'm part of the network, but because I saw how they were willing to push forward and resist to pressure from online and from individuals outside the organization. So thank you, TNI, and welcome to everyone on board. So my name is Yasser Louati. I'm a human rights and civil liberties activist. I co-founded the CJL, the Justice and Liberties for All Committee, and we work on matters of human rights violations through research investigation, popular and political education, and mobilizations. So the case of France is extremely important for the world to know. When you have China under Xi Jinping or the fascist Modi in India supporting France, when you have the Israeli occupier supporting France in its current policies towards Muslims, and when you have dictators around the world saying that if France can do it, so we can violate human rights and dismantle the rule of law, it means that France is using its reputation as the country of human rights. It's not. Since the declaration of since the revolution occurred, the First Republic and the Fifth Republic we live in under today have never been far from racism, slavery, and colonization. At no point in history, the French Republic separated itself from these racial crimes, so much so that today, I cannot honestly mention the French Republic without adding the French colonial republic, because it transpires its institutions. And before we speak of Islamophobia today as it is being applied by Emmanuel Macron, we have to keep in mind that this is not conjunctural. This is not an episode we might, go through and then, get done with. It's not. It's here to stay, because the colonial legacy is still permeating French institutions. So this, on top of having a colonial republic that was highly involved in the massacres of the past 20 years, 20 years, no, in the past multiple centuries, having contributed to various racist theories. We saw how France was on the cutting edge of anti-Semitism in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And today, Islamophobia is just the new example of normalized state racism. So we have an extremely authoritarian political regime, because the French Republic today is just a compromise between a monarchy and a republic. Hence, the obscene amounts of powers of the president. He nominates the prime minister. He can dissolve the National Assembly. He's the head of the army and head of the foreign policy of the country, which means if the president decides to implement a specific policy, we don't have strong checks and balances to keep him from that. And that's exactly what we are seeing today. So when we see Emmanuel Macron implementing far-right ideas, is because on top of having this bankrupt political system in France, we see that the mainstream has been permeated with far-right ideas. What was once the monopoly of the far-right, the connection between immigration and crime, immigration and terrorism, immigration and unemployment, immigration and threats to national identity, has also been taken over by the mainstream parties, both from the mainstream left, the Socialist Party, and the Conservative Party. So we see already that the mainstream political parties are already on agreement when it comes to Islamophobia. And that's why we need to keep an eye on the rising candidates for the next presidential election, because they will again agree on Islamophobia and disagree on the rest. The problem is that from the far right, Islamophobia has sipped all the way into the far left. People, for example, like Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's trying now to rebrand himself, have been part of the people who supported anti-Muslim policies. And just as Marine Le Pen has been doing that, we also saw Trotskyites with Lutte ouvrière, or working class struggle, supporting Islamophobia. So if we push further and if we dig further, we see that the commonality between all of that is that the media in France has been extremely biased towards Muslims. As a matter of fact, Muslims are always looked at through the lens of international relations. So in the 1970s, it was through the Iranian Revolution. In the 1980s, the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution, war in the Middle East, the Salman Rushdie affair. So constantly Muslims, as they were becoming integral part of France, they were constantly looked at as this forever foreign community. But on top of it, what actually provoked an extremely violent backlash in France is the day Muslims became political actors, because in the 1950s and 60s and early 70s, they were just a sociological phenomenon. The immigrant working in the factories, in the mines, and during the colonial enterprise and the First, Second World War, the parts of the colonial army. But in the 1970s, we saw that Arab workers began splitting from the mainstream unions, because even left-wing unions, and among them the CGT, the mother of all unions in France, Confédération Générale des Travailleurs, Arab workers had to separate from it because it was not taking racist crimes, discrimination, and police brutality seriously. But the triggering point is 1983, when the sons of immigrants became part of the political landscape. They organized the famous March of 1983, and within 6 months, a book was published from a center-right politician, de Griotere, and the book was actually an instant classic. It was called The Shock of Immigration. And his thesis was that these non-whites from the banlieue of Paris, Lyon, Marseille, etc., cannot be integrated. So we see that the day Muslims became political actors, immediately there was a backlash saying that those people cannot be part of our, national, narrative. On top of that, we see that a series of attacks on the law were initiated. There were, as early as 1986 and 87, there were attempts to change the citizenship code twice. Then there were attempts to ban the Muslim headscarf in 1989. The Council of the State back then supported the rights of Muslim girls to wear a headscarf in public schools. But what happened, that decision, which should have actually ended the feud between anti-Muslims and Muslims, actually infuriated Islamophobes in France and made them organize further and converge from the left and the right. So in 1989, we are mobilizing legislation against Muslims. So 1994, the first circular, which would allow school principals to expel Muslim girls from public schools. 2004, we had the ban, and where the media played an extremely toxic role, we see that in 2003, for example, we had millions of people marching against the neoliberal policies of Prime Minister Raffarin. He was changing the pension code, the pension funds in France, the public pensions. And as millions of people were in the street demonstrating against it, the media focused on the Muslim headscarf. For example, there was an account made for 2003. Over 1,200 pieces of media productions were published. Documentaries, pieces, investigations, reports, etc., etc. On the other hand, only 400 pieces were published for the marches against the pension reform. So nearly 1,300, more than 400. So almost 3 times more coverage of the Muslim headscarf. And as they were debating supposedly on the Muslim headscarf, Muslims were invisible. And so it is called for the mobilization of institutions, and the state was mobilized through the Stasi Commission. Bernard Stasi, who declared the first day, had we been asked to pass a law against the headscarf, he would have said no. But we had auditioned 103 people, and it seemed that there was an Islamist assault on the Republic. Problem is that the 103 people who were auditioned were actually all activists in favor of a ban and against the visibility of Muslims from the left, the right, and even what we call native validators. This means that we have a highly authoritarian republic. highly repressive, weak checks and balances. We also have a weak civil society, which is also polluted by anti-Muslim narrative. We have media coverage that is biased, and even left-wing media have played a role because they have kept Muslims invisible. So in order to allow for Muslims to speak for themselves, what happens with left-wing so-called progressive medias in France, I won't name them, but I create almost all of them, is that they will invite Blacks, Arabs, Muslims to come and complain about a problem, which means they have to fill the role of the victim. But when comes times for solutions, analysis, and calls for actions, it always comes from white people, meaning that this joins the theory that European progressive will oftentimes support the indigenous when he is doing occupying a specific role, but not when he wants to be equal and contribute to the debate of ideas. Now, to conclude, we have to keep in mind that we cannot speak of structural Islamophobia without speaking of the training of public servants, including in the justice system, which is itself not independent. So we have an extremely repressive regime called the Fifth Republic. And on top of it, we don't even have an independent judiciary, which would give a chance for minorities to uphold their rights. And the last point, and this is where this platform is extremely important, Islamophobia is not a Muslim problem only. It is not a Muslim-centric problem only. Why? Because anytime we see now an authoritarian drift throughout the West, the US, the UK, France, throughout Europe, and of course, governments are not going to tackle, implement, mass surveillance, permanent state of emergency, as is the case in France, by telling white people, you know what, now it's time for the state to be repressive. No, they will have to create an enemy within, the same way it was done with the Jews back in the 1930s. And that enemy within would call for extreme legislation. And that's why Muslims today are just the barometer of human rights and democracy in Europe. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Yasser, for kicking us off with a number of comments that I hopefully the other panelists will pick up as we continue. Maybe I think I'll move next to Nawal. So Nawal Mustafa is joining us from Amsterdam. Nawal is a doctoral student with the Vrije Universiteit here in Amsterdam. She's also a member of the Dutch feminist collective Speak. And Nawal, I think, will probably pick up on some of the questions that Yasser mentioned about gendered Islamophobia, and we'll bring them into her talking points. And I think Nawal is going to use some slides also. So maybe, Jess, if you can get the slides ready. But thank you very much, Nawal, for joining us today and for giving us some more information on the gendered Islamophobia.
Thank you so much for the invitation to speak and to talk about this important issue. Thank you, Yasser, for kicking us off. I want to build on what Yasser was saying. He gave a broad overview of what Islamophobia is and how what it constitutes in the case of France. What I would like to do is zoom in a little bit on if we look at gender, what happens if we look at gender? And I would like to do that by looking at specific case, and that is the case of the burqa ban in the Netherlands, for instance. And in terms of, in order to do that, I will use this concept called slow violence to show how gendered Islamophobia actually works. If we could go to the next slide. So I'm part of the Speak, a collective of Muslim women and also not Muslim women who focus on advocating for several things. So our key elements that we want to achieve in the Netherlands is contribute to public debate, which we have been doing by participating in writing opinion pieces, but also organizing the Women's March there, and actively participating with a specific color. The color purple, as you can see, is our color to show that feminism and ideas about gender equality should include Muslim women, and it doesn't have to be only about feminism from a specific perspective, mainly white feminism, where if you are covered, and I think that's also the case in France, if you're covered, you're considered to be anti-feminist, you're considered to be oppressed, and so on. So one of our key elements is key contributions that we would like to make is to influence public debate. The other thing that we have seen with the work that we do with Speak is that oftentimes organizations that advocate and activists that advocate against Islamophobia or racism are put in a reactionary position. So they hardly get to set the agenda and create the narrative through which we can engage with each other. So that is another thing that we want to do. And policy change, and obviously we also want to fight and advocate for the safety of Muslim women in public spaces, but also in private. And with that, I come to the next aspect of my talk, and that is the headscarf and the niqab bans throughout Europe. As you can see, many European countries have a niqab ban, and France has also a hijab ban for for schools. So what I wanted to do is why I want to zoom on this, and in the case of the Netherlands, is to show how gendered Islamophobia differently influences men and women. Oftentimes, men are influenced through the narrative of surveillance, through the figure of the terrorist, right? The one that we're afraid of. Whereas women are oftentimes stereotyped as submissive, as oppressed, as anti-feminist or not feminist, and so on, and so on. So what happens is that in order to free these so-called oppressed women, we are using feminist discourse to introduce legislations such as the niqab and scarf bans. So if we can go to the next slide. So what we have seen in the case of the Netherlands is that after each terrorist attack, especially the terrorist attacks that took place in France and in Belgium, is that women and girls who are identifiable as Muslim because they wear a headscarf or a niqab and so on, have been a target of violence. And so in order to understand how Islamophobia manifests and how it works in everyday lives of Muslims in different European countries, we have to look at the multiple subject positions that Muslims occupy. So oftentimes women are legislated because they are oppressed, and there is this narrative surrounding Muslim women being submissive and so on. So we have to force them to unveil in order to participate. At the same time, we're keeping them away from public life, and we're preventing them from entering the job market, education, and so on. So it's a double bind that sort of holds Muslim women captive in this way. And it is state legislation that is justifying basically the violence that is being done to Muslim women through individuals, but by legislating, by introducing these so-called bans, you're justifying and identifying Muslim women as the problematic other within our society. So you're casting them away from the job market. You are casting them away from swimming pools. If it comes to burkini bans, you're casting them away from internships when schools require you to do that because they're wearing a niqab or they're covered. On top of that, that trickles down into violence. So when a terror attack happens on European soil, the violence that, or the anger and the violence that people feel is targeted to these identifiable subjects. So they become also, which is also through the legislation, indirectly justified. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Why I want to zoom in on the headscarf bans and the niqab bans in the Netherlands is that when the niqab ban was introduced in the Netherlands, it was introduced through the far-right party, the Partij voor de Vrijheid, PVV. I don't know what the English term is. I'm sorry. So if somebody can help me, Partij voor de Party of the Freedom, I think is the correct translation. So when they introduced this so-called burqa ban 20 years ago, a lot of right-wing as well, a lot of left-leaning and centrist political parties were not in agreement with introducing this ban. It took 20 years, because it was introduced in 2019, for it to be downplayed, to be sort of mold into something that has become acceptable for the majority of the parties in the parliament right now. So it shows that the violence that women and especially the way gendered Islamophobia works is that it is, in the concept of slow violence, it's something that is not all at once. It is not as extreme as it might. So if somebody's attacked in the street, that is a clear-cut case and it's identifiable. But I believe the state violence and that is created through the legislation is violence that is simmering on throughout 20 years, if we look at the burqa ban, and which has a delayed destruction possibility. So it is not 20 years ago, I don't think it was, we couldn't have imagined that now we would be casting a significant, we would be casting people from our society who want to participate just because of the religious clothing that they wear. So I would like to focus a little bit. So we have structural Islamophobia and individual Islamophobia, but we also have to move away from looking at this only as something that is imminent and happening right now, and it's something that is built over a period of time. So we need to calculate time into it. And I think sometimes it's easy to look at a law that is based on surveillance or that has direct impact, which you can pinpoint and focus on that. And I think we should be aware of the destruction that is created by this Islamophobic discourse. And specifically, if we look at Muslim women who are being the invisible or at the same time hyper-visible victims of this. So I don't know how I'm doing with time.
I think we're just at 8 minutes. So
okay, so I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you very much, Nawal. And maybe just to mention that Nawal has just authored a paper for us, which details the very subject of gendered Islamophobia, and it's currently being edited, and we hope to publish at the beginning of December. So if you're interested, you can get more details on our website, but that should hopefully be coming out in the next few weeks. So thank you very much, Nawal, for your presentation. Now we're going to move to Britain. So I'm going to ask David and Nars to join us. So David Miller and Nars Massouni are based in Britain at both directors of Spinwatch. And Nars is at the University of Exeter and David is at the University of Bristol. So I've put the two presentations into, well, mix the two because you're both based in the UK, but I hope that maybe at some point, I know that the Institute for Race Relations today is doing a Twitter storm on safe passage and looking specifically at UK border policies. And I think I had mentioned that it would be good at some point to mention Schedule 7. So I think, Nars, you're going to discuss a little bit about Schedule 7, but just to give us a general overview also of Islamophobia in Britain, that would be great. So thank you very much, David and Nars, for joining us.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Oh, can you, sorry, we've got two computers, so the noise is coming. Hang on. Hello. Hi. Yeah, sorry. Thank you very much. And thank you to T&I for their work in bringing this webinar together. So I will talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing as part of this collective project and more broadly in terms of the UK context. So please tell me if I go on, because I'm going to speak for 5 minutes and then David's going to speak for 5 minutes. So Neve, if you could sort of wave or something so that I have a tendency to talk too much.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so the work that we've been doing in terms of this project and more broadly builds on a book that myself and David and others produced called What is Islamophobia, where we really looked at what Islamophobia is and sort of what kind of are the key actors responsible for putting the infrastructure of subordination of Islamophobia into sort of society. And so as a kind of collective, we made several arguments about what Islamophobia is. And the first is that, first and foremost, I think it's important that we say that Islamophobia should be considered a form of racism and taken as seriously as other forms of racism, which currently it is not, right? At multiple levels, institutional, Yasser talked about even like on the left, it's not taken seriously in that way. And I think that was one of the key things that we want to highlight. Secondly, we made arguments about where does Islamophobia come from within society, and focused on kind of the key pillars or the key kind of agents and actors of Islamophobia. And in particular, we make arguments about the role of the state, and in particular government counterterrorism policy as central to producing Islamophobia. But also that there are key social movements who work with and alongside the state to further an Islamophobic agenda and to put in place Islamophobic practices. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the UK government counterterrorism policy and how it disproportionately targets Muslims. And then David will talk a little bit more broadly about how this has spread more widely across Europe and about some of the social movements that I just mentioned. So since the beginning of the war on terror, so you're talking like 20 years now, the UK state, as have other European governments, have used kind of exceptional legislation which has targeted Muslims. And this has involved, surveillance, detentions without charge, extradition, and even citizenship removal. And the counterterrorism apparatus is a hugely inflated system with truly extraordinary powers. Since 2000 in the UK, there have been 15 acts of parliament that address terrorism or counterterrorism provisions, and these give the state greater powers. And the extraordinary nature of these powers and the way in which they target Muslims can really be seen in the example that Neve referred to, which is Schedule 7 of the Terrorism Act. And that is a particularly draconian power, whereby you can be stopped at UK ports without any cause for reasonable suspicion. Now, although no data exists on this for like religion, if you're of Pakistani heritage, you are 150 times more likely to be stopped by that measure than if you are white. So that shows the truly extraordinary nature of the sort of targeting of Muslims with these powers. And if you are, entering the UK, or you can often see quite visibly people being pulled out of the queue, and often Muslim men who are being sort of stopped and questioned. And this is for no reason, because they don't need to provide a reason. Now, that's one key example of a kind of harder form of the kind of counterterrorism powers. However, there has been a sort of expansion of the counterterrorism apparatus beyond the kind of traditional home of security and intelligence and police into other areas of public life. So, and this has been done through the PREVENT program, and which has gone through various forms of iterations. PREVENT is based on this idea that there's some kind of continuum between radical ideas and terrorism, i.e. that terrorism comes about in the context of people having some kind of radical ideas, and the aim of PREVENT is to sort of target those ideas. And this has now become embedded within a whole range of institutions, from health to education, welfare, social services, and youth work, and is undermining the fabric of those social institutions. In the UK, the first sort of iteration of PREVENT was primarily focused on Muslims, and with an initial attempt to work with government-friendly Muslim organizations to help defeat terrorism. And the government sought to recruit specific organizations that they thought would be helpful to the government and would promote the government strategy. But this kind of attempt failed for a number of reasons. It was, widely seen as sort of involvement in surveillance in the program, engaged trying to collect data on Muslims. It was also lacked credibility amongst Muslim communities in the UK, and partly as well as a result of a change in government at the time, the policy shifted and actually became more aggressive. And one of the things that happened at this time was it introduced a statutory duty, whereby it became a statutory duty for public institutions to pay due regards to prevent people from being drawn into terrorism. And this applies to health and social services and nurseries and libraries and all across the public sector, and has meant that accessing has kind of introduced racial profiling and stigmatization of Muslims into public institutions, making those services harder to be less accessible for Muslims, and also undermining Muslims' participation in public life. And since that kind of duty was introduced, in the several years that it's been going on, between 4,500 to 7,000 and a bit people are being referred every year, which is the equivalent to about 12 to 20 people a day. And this is kind of being referred to their kind of de-radicalization program. And the one sort of disturbing aspect of this is that a large number of these are children, and this has included children as young as 3. So who have been referred from nurseries, from showing signs of radicalization. Now, it really is kind of beyond belief what a sign of radicalization would be in a 3-year-old. But this also has a wider impact on those public institutions themselves, because it undermines, these are spaces of social rights. And in schools, it's hard to teach about certain subjects, particularly if you're a Muslim teacher, but also Muslim pupils are self-censoring because they're scared about talking about certain subjects in case that they're seen to be misunderstood and referred to a sort of de-radicalization program, or even just taken out and be spoken to or stigmatized in some way. There's reports of more bullying of Muslim students in places like a university where I work. It has transformed the ability for us to do research and teaching around certain areas, and has undermined students' ability to kind of organize political meetings and things. Now, I'll finish here and just say one thing before David can continue. The whole policy of Prevent has moved more and more towards a more authoritarian direction. And Muslims have been the people who have felt the sharpest end of these policies. But recently we've seen that the target of Prevent has expanded further and further to include environmental groups. So a police training manual recently showed a list of kind of extremists, which included organizations like Extinction Rebellion and other environmental direct action groups, anti-racist groups and anti-war groups, and even a peaceful environmental direct action cycling group was listed as extremist. So, there's been this shift, and that one of the key shifts as well has been that recently the government has engaged in more covert action around engaging with Prevent and Muslim civil society, which David will talk about now, and also about Europe more widely. So thank you.
David, do you want to go ahead? I think you're still on mute. Yeah, I think we can hear it.
Yep.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you, David.
So I wanted to say a couple of things about the spread across Europe of these policies, and also about the question of covert operations undermining civil society. So the first thing to say is that I absolutely take everything that Yasser says about the Republic and laicite and all that, and very, very good analysis of that given by him. But what I wanted to suggest is something about the commonality of counterterrorism policies as they've moved across Europe. So the Prevent policy was first introduced in the UK in 2003, so very shortly after 9/11, and it was the first of its kind in Europe. And what then happened was that it was adopted in a number of countries across the European space. That we looked at 5, 6 or 7 countries. And we looked at that, and we can show that the same policy of Prevent was introduced in the EU in 2005, following the Madrid bombings of 2004. Then it was introduced in the Netherlands in 2005. It took a while before it was introduced into France, with the kind of the neoconservatization of France in 2012-13, especially under the influence of Manuel Valls and his neocon advisors. Then in Spain in 2015-16, that kind of policy was introduced, the prevent policy was introduced in Spain under the influence in that case very much of neoconservative think tanks associated with Aznar and indeed with the far-right Vox party. Now, the only country that we looked at where this policy was not introduced was Italy. And that was an interesting example, because what happened was the neocons got together to try and force through a new prevent style policy. And they were successful. It was passed through the parliament. But what happens that very shortly afterwards was that the parliament was dissolved and they had elections, and so the policy slipped. So Italy was the only country we looked at which has not got a prevent style policy. And one of the things we did was we looked at the way in which media coverage reflected or didn't reflect the kinds of policies that there were in the countries we looked at. We found a very, very close relationship. Whenever a country introduced a policy of prevent or on radicalization and extremism, that the media were full of the terminology of radicalization in relation to Muslims. Either it was the case, as in France, for example, that the Domestic Intelligence Agency was the most cited source in French coverage of these issues, and in the UK, the domestic and foreign intelligence agencies were amongst the top sources, or in Spain, and indeed in the UK, where neoconservative think tanks were amongst the most influential sources quoted in the media. So you can see that there was a pressure there through the media to enact these prevent style policies, and they've moved across a whole range of other countries too, which we didn't look at. So I wanted to say that there's been a kind of neoconservatization of counterterrorism policy towards this idea of radicalization and extremism, an idea which has no social scientific basis, which was invented simply by both neoconservatives and the security apparatus, especially in this country, the intelligence services in this country. And there's a huge variety of research now on radicalization by academics, but the concept itself has no empirical basis, is a useless concept for understanding political violence, and indeed, of course, focuses people on targeting things which are nothing to do with political violence, especially signs of Muslim religious observance, which are now regarded as being in some way on the pathway towards political violence, which of course is manifestly absurd, as well as being frankly Islamophobic. And so that's been the policy area. Now I wanted to talk about a second area, which is the question of the covert operations. Now, Nars mentioned the start of this covert operation in the UK with a department, an intelligence agency in the UK called RICU, the Research, Information and Communications Unit, which was involved in doing fake grassroots campaigns and pretending that they were run by independent Muslim organizations, a group called Inspire, alleged to be a women's rights organization, actually an intelligence front, a group called Faith Matters, an intelligence front, a website called This Is Woke, an intelligence front. And that was a policy which was developed in the UK from 2011 onwards and was very successful in manipulating Muslim civil society. And what we found in our research for this project was that this model has been exported right across Europe through the EU, and the EU institutions have a very, very serious set of questions to answer as a result of this. What's happened is that the RICU, the intelligence agency, have introduced their working methods right across Europe through the Radicalization Awareness Network of the EU, and indeed an organization called the European Strategic Communications Network, which is in fact, which says that it's there to give communications advice, but which is in effect a British intelligence front group to try and manage and manipulate civil society groups. And so they've set up this new thing called the Civil Society Empowerment Program, which in actual fact is a civil society manipulation program dedicated to using British intelligence agents to run fake grassroots campaigns as if they come from Muslim civil society groups. So there's a real significant set of questions to be asked of EU counterterrorism policy and radicalization policy, which is bought into this. And many of the people who are involved, for example, in the Radicalization Awareness Network, some 3,000 of them, have no idea that this is just the British intelligence front. And that's one of the key things that we found in our research, and which raises significant issues for the EU as a political institution about its involvement with what they themselves at the top of the EU know is a British intelligence operation. So that was the key finding that we had in the research that we did on this. So just to conclude then, the way in which Islamophobia has spread across Europe has been to do with the kind of policies which have been adopted, which have copied the UK model, plus the kind of internal histories of the countries, like in France with laïcité, etc. But they've also been Islamophobia has also been spread by covert operations, by the manipulation of civil society groups. And if we want to roll it back, it's not just a question of meeting the far right on the street. It's also a question of rolling back some of these government policies which have been key to advancing Islamophobic ideas and anti-Muslim bias.
Thanks very much, David, for that. And indeed, a terrifying picture, I think, both from David and Nars about the level of surveillance and policing and spying that is going on, and even the statutory duty of healthcare workers, of teachers, to basically spy on their students and on their patients. It seems like, it's very dark, I think. The very dark times, I think, for freedom of expression and freedom of any sort, when these are the policies that are coming to us from the state down. I'm now going to ask Pedro Rojo to join us. Pedro is based in Spain. He's the director of Al-Fanar Foundation for Arab Knowledge. And he, I think, is going to pick up on some of the points that David also mentioned about the role of the media and the role of the internet. And I think in particular the work that Al-Fanar has been doing in Spain on the area of media. So I'm going to ask Pedro to join the conversation. Thanks, Pedro. Gracias.
Thank you. Yes, let me share the screen. Yes, what I'm going to do is focus on a very specific issue, which is the media and the internet, on how the Muslims are portrayed in Spain in the media, and a little bit at the end, some analysis we did with a campaign on the veil we did in Spain. Why on the media? Because in 2000, where we go? Okay. In 2017, we've been, as Al-Fanar, working on translating Arab press and trying for the Spanish media to talk a little bit better on the Arab world, and using Arab fonts. And after the attacks in France, we found, or we have a sense that it was an increase of Islamophobia in the media. So we created with IMED in Barcelona and now Observatory from Madrid, what is the Observatory of the Islamophobia in the media in Spain. Because when you discuss the issue of Islamophobia, normally the media used to say, no, in Spain it's not happening. Well, it was not happening. We did the first analysis, nearly 1,700 articles in 2017 from 6 different newspapers, which is, a wide type of newspapers in terms of ideology, but also online, etc. And we came across that nearly 70% of the articles written, they were Islamophobic. Okay, so that's the beginning. We have the point to start, which was important because it's an academic methodology, which is on the website. Anyone want to see it on the Observatory of Islamophobia. In 2018, we get a little bit better. We analyze over 2,000 articles, and we got an important decrease, nearly 60% now of the articles. They are not Islamophobic, okay? What you see here is red, which are strongly Islamophobic articles, and the yellow is what we call the passive Islamophobia, which is not so clear, not so easy to, let's say, to get or to understand like a direct insult to Islam or to a generalization about Muslims since as terrorists or radicals as a whole. That will be the red one. So that's interesting. We call this decrease the work we have done with media. The first report in 2017 was well covered in Spain, and it got to a lot of newspapers, and is what we call it the change of unconscious Islamophobia. Journalists that they were not aware that writing or Islamic terrorist was something that could be, create Islamophobia or keep the stereotypes. So that's a small change that, for example, to give you an example, a clear example, here you have La Razón, which is a newspaper from the, let's say, very conservative or right spectrum of the Spanish media. And they were at the beginning of 2017, they were about 85% of Islamophobic articles. When we talked with the director and he talked with the journalists, in that very same year, they decreased from 84% in the first semester to 50 something. Okay, that's what means that we believe that there is a group of journalists or people that they can get conscious of what is writing about Islam and how we provide them a few glossary of how to do it and some clues. But what is important is that in 2019 that we analyzed exactly the same, because in 2017 we include two press agencies instead of only newspapers, but in 2019 we got the same newspapers than in 2017, except 20 minutes was irrelevant in terms of number. Okay, so this is what is the difference. The big difference is that we are not at it was nearly 65% of Islamophobic articles, and now we are in nearly 65% of non-Islamophobic articles. But what happened? We really are in what we call we think is the top of the decrease so far, because even if the red Islamophobia have decreased 5%, which is good, the amber one is still at the very same level that 2018, and that's what we call, or we think, is the structural Islamophobia. That's what is difficult or more difficult to change, because what is here remaining is this far right or really Islamophobic articles that they are very clear that they go to attack Islam, or they have an agenda on that. No, so for this issue we have done some campaigns, and the idea is to grow conscience in the Spanish society, as now it's not acceptable to have a racist article in the media. Why it's still something normal to have Islamophobic article opinion? Okay, it's opinion. Well, if it's a racist or a sexist article is not acceptable, that has to change. But this 20% is what we think is the most difficult point to change, and this is what is the base of this structural Islamophobia, plus the red one, who is more strategic. And this is what I think is a challenge for us to get or to change at society. And very quickly also, this is a very important analysis. This is the positive news and negative news, even if they were Islamophobic or not. Why nearly 90% of the news that they are wrote about Muslims, they are negative news? In 2019, we get a little bit better, 73% of negative news. But what is interesting in 2019 is that there were not any terrorist attack or big issue related with terrorists in Spain or Europe, which is the news we cover. And even so, the most used or the most writing theme in the Spanish newspaper, it was radicalism and terrorism when they talk about Muslim community in Europe. Okay, very quickly, the imagine of the Spanish Muslim and the internet is more or less the same. We have 70%, 75% of the mentions about Islamic veil, they have to be with conflict and negative. And why I say that? Because what we did with this campaign that was part also of this program, Stop Islamophobia, we create a video in 8 languages talking about the veil, talking about taking away the labels that they are normally attached to the veil. We get nearly 8 million interactions. This is only in Spanish, okay, not in the other 7 languages, and 2.5 million of viewers, 3,500 likes, and more than 1,500 messages that we analyze. We did with the University of Murcia, with Pilar Garrido and Rocío Zamora, an analysis of those messages, and this is very fast. We have the same, more or less, percentage of negative news, okay, or messages. 71% of the messages, they were negative about comments about this video. And the main way of talking, and I think this is the important issue, nearly half of these messages, they talk from this superiority, this neo-colonialism, this Orientalist view of the woman and the Muslim woman. We know what is good for you. We know what is freedom, and we are going to tell you, even if the campaign was, I mean, full of testimonies from Muslim women in Spain. And just to finish, this is another analysis we did when we launched the guide for media, from Islam and media, also from this Stop Islamophobia project. And this is very interesting because this is the what's around Alfanar is what is the conversation between what we said and all this other is the negative and aggression. What it means that the links and between one and the other is very, very weak. And only they, the negative message, they make conversation between themselves, and very few is these tiny lines. They go back and forwards with what we try to measure. So that's also another challenge, how to get into debate or to exchange idea in the internet, and to change that 75% of negative ideas on Muslims and in the Spanish internet. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pedro, for that. I am going to move now to Francesco Alfonso Lesese, who's joining us from Italy, from Naples. Francesco is at the University of Calabria. And Francesco will also detail a bit the situation with the media in Italy. And just to say, we're at 5 o'clock and we still have one more speaker after Francesco, and we have some questions also. So let's, yeah, if we can stick to the time, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much, Francesco.
Thank you. Thank you to all. Thank you for this invitation. I'm Professor of Islamic Studies at University of Calabria. I want to thank Ponte Per that with me and with other colleagues in Italy organized a lot of workshops and debates in our Italian university. Today I will speak about which is the situation of the Muslim presence in Italy. First of all, we have to say that the Islamic presence dates back to the late 70s, and with a very heterogeneous and mixed backgrounds. And still today, the most important community of Muslims are of Moroccan origin, and followed by the communities of Muslims from Albania, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Egypt. This is very interesting because despite this data, we can say that in Italy, there is a really lack of awareness of this extraordinary diversity of Muslim communities. And the majority of the Italian population does not distinguish these various Muslim communities seen as a unique new race, we can say, the so-called Muslim race. Moreover, we can say that the next slide, please. Thank you. Moreover, we know that in the political agenda, the right and the far right propaganda equate Muslim with migrants. This is one of the main topics of the Islamophobic discourse in Italy. We can see this data. They are very updated data that were published last week, and we know that Muslim are the second religion of Muslim religion is the second one in the migrants. So the so-called slogan, all migrants in Italy are Muslims, there is a Muslim invasion, it's not true. We see on this data that Christians are near to 52%, Muslims are only the second, and this is a very different number. We can say that this is very interesting because also in the languages, Italian languages, we have a kind of reification. The newspaper and the Islamophobic discourse never use the word Muslims, musulmani in Italian, but they use a new word. The kind of new word is islamico, islamici. It's like Islamics that is used in Italian language for adjective, and this is a kind of racist and the use of reification of people of Muslim religion that is used in all the newspaper. Later we will see something. Please, next slide. One of the main topic in the debate, in the Islamophobic debate, is about the idea that Muslims want to be distinct. Here we see two data from peer review research from 2016 to 2019, and is interesting because in many European countries, also in Italy, in 2019 there was a change about you see 14% was less uncomfortable with the Muslims. But if we ever show to the next slide, also this slide is very updated. This was published by Vox Diritti, which is the Italian Observatory on Rights, that publish every year a map on intolerance. And this map of intolerance is very interesting because you can see that 65% of Italian Muslims declared to be being an object of violence, prejudice, or discriminations, and 57% of Italians would not accept a Muslim as a family member. Very interesting, very Islamophobic. 38% think that Islam is incompatible with modern society, and 35% of Italians would not like to have a Muslim neighbor. These are the data. You see also on this map of intolerance the tweeting against Muslim with the bad words, the Islamophobic words, terrorist, Maghrebian, like before some days the traditional Italian word was vucumbra. Do you want to buy? It was a way of saying in Italian language for the street sellers. and all these tweets are concentrated in the north of Italy, especially in Lombardia, where are present the most important communities of Muslims. We can have a look also to the next slide. Okay, this is something about what I can call a kind of a cultural Islamophobia. You can find this citation. This is a fake citation of Oriana Fallaci everywhere in the website or Facebook groups or the right or far right. Not all Muslims are terrorists, but almost all terrorists are Muslims. This is very interesting because it's a citation not of Oriana Fallaci, but thanks to this journalist of the far right, Giuliano Ferrara, and one of his interview is cited as one of the main intellectual base for the Islamophobia thinkers. You see also this this image on the left, Salvini Premier, stop Eurabia, against the immigration, against the penetration of Muslims, thanks to migratory policies of the left. And we know that migratory policies of the left in Italy are not so open as they picture. The next slide, political Islamophobia. This political Islamophobia is perceivable in some political leader like Matteo Salvini. You see this these two declarations. Islam is incompatible with Italian constitutions. Also Islam is does not defend the rights of women. And this other one, the only extremism that deserves attention is the Islamic one. And it's interesting because this declaration issued the day after the terrorist attack in Christchurch Mosque, New Zealand. And so is really shocking. Next slide. Also, this idea of political Islamophobia, this securitization of policies are linked to some strange popular law proposal, like this one of Fratelli d'Italia, Brothers of Italy, that was called Islamic, was asking for introducing an Islamic integralism crime. This was not a request that has a lot of following in the parliament. Nobody care about it. But you see also in 2018 there was a manifestation against the politics of the mayor of Naples and Garibaldi Place, where there is a great community of Muslims from Senegal, and where there are several not mosque but prayers halls was renamed. You see Islam Place, not Garibaldi Place, but Islam Place. Also the next, please. The next slide, please. This political Islamophobia is always with some kind of slogans. Arabia, the Islamization of Europe, and also the think tank of Brother of Italy issue every year an annual report on the Islamization of Europe that is open source online with this PDF and with all the numbers on all the numbers of this demographic assault to the Christian Europe. Please, the next. And these are the rights. These are the parties in the parliament. But in Italy, we have also some kinds of neo-fascist movements that does not have a place in the parliament, like this one is Forza Nuova. In 2017 election for mayor of Rome, make this advertisement, stop the alien invasion, with the group of ISIS members. Also, the next one from neo-fascist groups like Casa Pound. You see the slogan is Italian first, and also why don't you care about people of your city? You care about Muslims. The next one is also interesting because it's about the banning against the proposing of opening a mosque or Islamic center. You see, no mosque, defend Milan, Islam outside Italy. The next one you can see also this issue is very important for the far right movements. You say this Vox Italia, its Facebook page has a very relevant name, No Islam Italia. Also the next, and you see that the real number of mosques in Italy is only 10, and you see that 5 real mosques and the others are all almost garage places for prayers. The neo-fascist movements slogans are close the borders, Italian first. You say this one, Casa Pound in Milan, 2017 for Sanoa. You have this kind of manifestation, but it's interesting that you can find something not related to neo-fascism also in the journals. The next one.
We'll have to maybe start.
Okay.
Do we have much more for Francesco?
No. We are going to finish. I'm going to finish.
Okay.
You see in the media the titles: Islamic bastards catch away Muslim for our home, and also the titles against Silvia Romano. And the next one, please. Islamophobia in the media, and some in some newspaper like La Verità, and a lot of books. Islam craziness, the truth about Islam, or this is Islam again after the attacks in Paris. And next, you see also this use of books like Stop Islam or The Real Islam, and all these kind of books that are a real kind of Islamophobic gender in the bookshelves of our country. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Francesco. We'll move straight to Benedicte. Benedicte Koersen is a photographer with Noor, based also here in Amsterdam, which was also part of our project, Stop Islamophobia. And Benedicte traveled to France and did some photography work, taking images of what Islamophobia means. So Benedicte is going to talk about some of the images and also her experience in the project. Thanks, Benedicte.
Yeah, thank you, Nian. Very nice to be with all of you and to also feed the ongoing reflection about Islamophobia. It's very enriching and I'm learning a lot. It's also a bit scary, to be honest, but we all knew that, right? The project that I produced on Islamophobia, it's part of a broader project that Noor Images produced. It gathers the work of 5 different photographers in 5 different parts of Europe. So we are trying to dissect and analyze, and our job is actually to give a visual shape to particular issues. Islamophobia was not an easy one because it's extremely, how can I say, intangible in a way. It's a move through words. So my approach to it was to really focus, the starting point of it was really focused on the state of emergency in France that happened between November 2015, straight after the attack in Paris, until end of 2017, and how the government used the state of emergency to reinforce a narrative. And I think Yasser and some of you outlined this narrative extremely well. the narrative that, for instance, Muslims are, if you are a Muslim, you're not part of the greater civil society that France wants to be, basically. And how, so I decided to try to find families who were ready to testify. There has been a huge number of house raids during the state of emergency. Go slowly on the slide. Huge number of house raids, a little bit more than 4,400, resulting in only 23 court cases for association to terrorism activities. There has been like tens of mosques that have been closed down and people under house arrest. So there has been a certain, we have a word in French that is quite good, matraquer. There has been a very specific targeting of an entire community that is basically paying the price for the activities of an extreme minority, and de facto also a very clear political will to associate Muslim citizens with the greater ideology built around Islam from Rabat to Paris. And in that sense, the project is, I'm trying to both reflect on the media mechanisms that are, for instance, so we can come back to the previous slide, please. So and the previous one, sorry. So the idea was to try to translate one of the essential mediatic mechanism of Islamophobia, which is basically overexposing certain people and de facto erasing first their personal history, their individuality, their personal history. So I've been using Flash to really kind of erase and rubs off any form of particularism linked to them, which is a visualization of this mediatic pattern of constantly associating Muslim citizens to a negative perception, which completely prevent them from being part of the citizen group. And marginalizing them, especially in France, where we have a very strong history linked to colonization and also marginalizing people who are of Muslim confession. And the idea was the second layer, the second trigger to the work. So as you see, it is not exactly in the final form because the COVID happened and we didn't have time to finalize the project in its final form. But we want to, with the people, in a collaborative way, fill up those wide gaps that are created by the Flash with words. So, and with the words that they want to share, either about their experience, traumatic experience about the state of emergency. So for instance, here there is Rama, who is part of the Aziz family. And basically there was a whole discussion around either whether to take part in the project or not, because of course, a lot of those people have been already heavily stigmatized. But so we didn't want to stigmatize them even further. And the idea is just to give them also a chance to either share their experience or also fill up this gap with whatever they feel like sharing. So offer them like a platform to express themselves. We can, and here I will translate, sorry, I'm going a bit too fast. Here I will translate. This was, she says, the question, and I'm also playing on the ambiguity of the word. So the question is, do you know terrorists? The answer is yes. And the other following question is that who are they? And the answer is you. And this is the part of the dialogue. Rama gave me the permission to use this part of the dialogue that she had with the policeman who actually raided her family in the middle of the night. So the idea of this project was also to give flesh and blood and to a story that is related, that is spoken about in the media, but again, always in a very abstract way, talking about house raids and talking about counterterrorism. And so the media are very powerful in the way that they are reinforcing this this narrative of so-called preventive repression. Let's move on to the next slide. Next one. So I spent a little bit of time with the family, and I think it was very interesting to be able to capture those moments with them. Next slide. And again. Yeah. So those images also, along with the with few characters, I built the project on, and it's an ongoing project. I think it's important to mention. I was trying to portray the places where they live, because of course in France there is not only the marginalization of people who are Muslim confession, but there is also, I think, Yasser can, and Yasser, please interfere whenever you have something to add, because you know you have full authority over me in this regard. So I wanted to introduce also the social dimension of into the story by not necessarily interviewing people on their social background, even though the personal stories is completely part of the project. So there is a lot of like written elements, but also the aesthetic and where those people are living, which is fairly important because all those neighborhoods are usually on the margin of the urban centers. Let's move on to the next slide. This is the this is Patricia. She converted. That's the mother of Rama, and yeah, she was just extremely willing to be portrayed. And unfortunately, after the house raid actually triggered her diabetes. So the family also took this project as a way to I don't know, as a catharsis. They really were eager to make it public, and I think Rama was. I mean, we're still in touch, and she's very how can I say? I don't know if photography can ever play a role in maybe helping people. I would never pretend it does in an effective way, but I hope it does. Let's move on to the next slide. So the second aspect of the project, because I think it's very important to build up those projects, especially when it comes down to Islamophobia, with like a lot of different layers, to not only contextualize, but addressing that happened from the past. What happened between 2015 and 2017 is also the result of a very long colonial history. It's the result of like, you know, of ongoing colonial mentality and ideology. And so, because I work predominantly in Marseille, because it's close to my home, I wanted to start there. I decided to also make landscape of places where during the 70s and the 80s, people had been murdered, not only because they were Muslim, but also because they were just brown people, I mean, randomly. Racist crime, let's say, and we have a specific crime, we have a specific words to describe those crimes. We call them ratonnades, and it's and I wanted to layer the portrait of those family who had been completely like targeted by the French government. I wanted to layer it with this long history of crime that have been either not handled, as Yasser was mentioning, not handled by justice, where there hasn't been any form of justice beyond the actual crime scene. But this is to lay out the Marseille, the landscape in Marseille and this long history. Next slide. Yeah, this is also this is Ainouche, and he's the imam of a very famous market in Marseille. And even though he hasn't been house raided, his bank accounts had been frozen. So they had like probably the house raid and the house arrest have been the most let's say brutal and let's say sensationalist sort of a measure or thing that happened during state of emergency, but I thought it was really important to include in the project also all the minor effects, because they can really leave the people stranded and really affect their life in many different ways. And I think it's very important to mention all the tools that the government has used to target people of Muslim confession during that period of time, in full impunity, of course. Next slide. And this is Abdelaziz Shambi again so I'm using, I think in this, and the next slide, maybe we can move. So the process of process I'm using to both hide and overexpose people, and then of course like long interviews with them being transcribed in these white parts, you know. So we are trying to kind of through this process compensate this invisibility and this lack of let's say platform. Like somebody like Abdelaziz is like a very incredible figure of both social and for the role. Like, how would you describe him in proper terms, Yasser? Like, he's an icon, right? Yeah. And he's been a militant for the past, let's say, 40 years probably, in trying to both a social militant, but not only for people of social background, but also for Muslim in France, which is, I would say, a very interesting and incredible combination. So yeah, I went to see him in Lyon, and he was very open in also explaining that he was fiché S during the state of emergency. Next slide. And that's, yeah, I won't comment any further, and I think that's the end. I think I said everything. Sorry, it's a little bit challenging to comment and pack, because so much have been said already. But yeah.
No, thank you so much, Benedicta, for that. I think it was a good way to, I think, bring the discussion to a close as well, to see the faces of the people who've been on the receiving end, I think, of much of the policies, very terrifying policies and practices that we've been listening for the last hour and a half. We're nearly out of. Sorry.
Can I just add very, very briefly? So there was an exhibition showing in Amsterdam, in Melkweg. It doesn't take place anymore. So we are trying to move the exhibition in different places, especially in Europe. To be honest, I think we're struggling because a lot of the feedback that we're getting is that the topic is too sensitive, which is really interesting. So we would like to, I would like to use this platform to say also that whoever as a way to move this exhibition in various places, we would be more than happy to provide them with the exhibition package, because I believe we need to talk to a really large audience and move the work in different spaces.
Indeed, Benedicta, I actually went to the exhibition, and a number of us here in Amsterdam did, and we can share the details also in the chat, and maybe with those of us, with those who are still listening, if they want details on the exhibition. Indeed, it should travel around Europe, and hopefully it will, because it was a fantastic piece of work. And I think it sums up a lot of what we said when you say it's too sensitive topic to show at the moment. I think that kind of says it all. Unfortunately, we're nearly out of time. We've only 1 minute left. So some of the questions that have been posed have been already resolved, and the questions and answers function on the Zoom feature for questions and answers. And I think that if any of those haven't been resolved, if you want to send your question through again to Jess, to the TNI email, and we can make sure that it reaches the person that you want to get it to. Because yeah, we've really come to the end of our session. So I think maybe just to close by saying, I think that, you know, we always hear of Europe as being the home of fundamental rights, and that France is the home of freedom and liberty and justice. And I think that I see Yasser laughing. And I think that when we hear these kinds of details that we've heard over the last hour and a half, it's absolutely terrifying. I think we're in a very dark moment in Europe, where Muslims are being scapegoated, their homes are being raided, they're being targeted, they're being put in prison. There are, as David also mentioned, there's no empirical basis for this. We've also heard from NARS about how counterterrorism policies do not work. We have 3-year-old children being taken aside and questioned for radicalization. What can that possibly look like in a 3-year-old child? There's more surveillance, there's more policing, there's more discrimination, there's more spying, covert operations, and it's really terrifying. At the moment, one of the questions was, what will Europe look like in 5 or 10 years' time? And I think that that's a question that we should all take with us, panelists and also the participants. What kind of Europe do we want in 5 or 10 years' time? Because I think where we are at the moment is particularly terrifying. So I think I suppose it's a role for all of us to organize and to push back against the kind of authoritarianism that we're seeing. Unfortunately, I don't have time to give the floor again to panelists. So I think that just on my side, just to say thanks a million, thanks to Yasser, to David, to Nars, to Nawal, Pedro, Francesco, Benedict, also to Jess, to Niels, and to Nick, who've been watching on the chat, and to everyone who helped us to get the webinar together. To all of the people who tuned in. It's been really interesting, and hopefully we can continue our discussions either on this format, or you can contact TNI for more information. And yeah, I think that we'll have to leave it at that. We could continue speaking for another few hours on this subject, but unfortunately we have to leave it at that. So thank you everyone very much for your participation. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye. Bye.
Thank you. Grazie. Buonasera a tutti.
Buonasera.
Ciao.
Ciao.
Ciao, ciao Benedict.